Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thanks for joining us. And in this chat or live stream, I'd like to talk about mixed race relationships in the West and talk generally about how successful it's been, assuming mixed race, the number of mixed race relationships is a measurement of success. I'm not sure it is, but let's just look at the subject generally, the torrents of propaganda that we're being subject to, and the huge amounts of taxpayer money without our consent or knowledge that's being spent on this mixed race relationship propaganda. So I think we've all seen the torrent of propaganda and brainwashing nonsense on television, in sitcoms, in billboards, propaganda at all levels, schools, the whole nine yards. And the general assumption seems to be that white people are being resistant to intermarrying with black and brown people that are being brought into the West, of course, en masse. Again, this immigration, these people being brought in without the consent of the governed, nor would any population consent to what's going on, which is why they have to do it regardless of our agreement and our consent and approval and so on. We're just not allowed to vote and these sort of things. They're being imposed upon us, and that's it. Now, looking at the whole question of intermarrying and mixed relationships, you'd think from the propaganda and again the movies and the TV shows that every white person in existence is married to a brown or black person, or has a black or brown girlfriend, boyfriend, and also that every white person, their bestest friend, the bestest buddy is a black or a brown person, or both. White people don't seem to have white friends anymore, or white buddies. So, or so you'd think from looking at the rubbish and the propaganda that's being pushed on us from Hollywood and all over the place. So now this has been going for quite a while. I remember as a kid watching, say, police shows and various cop shows and things like that on television, and the police commissioner or the police captain was always black. The lead officer, the sort of star of the show, may be a white guy, but his offsider was always black or brown. The female detectives or police officers were usually majority black or brown, particularly brown, and this was just sort of how when I remember all that as a kid. It seemed to go a bit over my head, because I remember as a kid I looked at it and thought, that's not very realistic, but hey, that was the show, and 10, 11, 12 years old, 13 years old, I watched it, but I knew that it was no reflection of real life at all, that it was a complete fantasy. So what I did recently and I got some help doing this, I went to a shopping centre, a busy shopping centre in Sydney, Australia, and this is an area that's intensively populated with brown and black migrants. So and there's also a university not that far away which specialises in advanced degrees such as masters, PhDs and so on for international students. And most of these students, once they get their qualification, they tend to be given residency or citizenship and stay. So it's a good cross section, and it's got about a 15% white, 85% black and brown. So that's roughly the mix of that particular area. So I went to look at and this was a busy Saturday. There's a lot of sales on and that sort of thing. So it was bustling, to say the least. And I got some help for this. We sat down and looked at mixed race relationships. Now, we're prepared to accept any mixed race. It could be white with non-white. It could be, say, Chinese with Indian, or any other Asian, any other Asian with a different sort of Asian, that sort of thing. So say, for example, a Filipino with a Malaysian, or somebody from Indonesia with somebody from Japan or something. We're prepared to accept any mixed race relationship of any kind. And if we're going to find it, this was the place. And there's quite a lot of the kids there who are, say, in their late teens, early 20s. They were either came to Australia at a very young age, preschool age, or they were born in Australia. So they've got no reason necessarily to have that issue where they've come from another country, say at 15, 16 years old, and they haven't really integrated or anything like that. So we had a look at this, and in terms of whites having a relationship with any other racial group, then, and we stopped counting, by the way, at 1,000 couples. So we're probably somewhere between 12 and 1,500 in total. But just on only four in total, only four white people were with non-white partners. So it gives you an idea of how minimal the integration's been between whites and others. So it was very, very rare, as you can see from those numbers, less than 1%. Now, of those four, there was an elderly gentleman, white gentleman, with a particularly young Asian girl. And it looked like some of those 1970s Vietnam movies where soldiers were seeking recreation. It had that sort of look about it, and then two were what appeared to be, certainly on just looking at it from afar, a serious relationship. So it doesn't matter where people come from in the world; they can still fall in love. But then looking at mixed relationships, say Indians, people from the subcontinent, having relationships outside of their own racial group. Again, less than 1%. In fact, that was probably the most rare. Asians, for example, Chinese with a Filipino, things like that. Again, very rare. So at a maximum between the brown people, it was 2%. 2% mixed race relationships. So in spite of all the propaganda, in spite of people even being born in Australia, they're simply not integrating, certainly in terms of mixed race relationships. So mixed race relationships are very rare. And let's put a generous face on it and say it's 2%, because that would be the outside. So all this money that's being spent on propaganda, they're either going about it the wrong way, which you could certainly argue, or it's just a complete failure. Generally, it's just a nut they're not going to be able to crack, or certainly not in anything less than, say, 7 to 10 generations. So why is that, though? Why would Indian people or Chinese people born in Australia, who've been right through the Australian school system, college, why would they still only hang out with people from their own racial group? That they don't need to, but they do. And this is an interesting sort of thing. And I was on a train, and I don't often take the train, but I was on a train that was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I suppose, or thereabouts. And there was a lot of children, of course, coming out of school, the high schools in particular. And I noticed on the train that the Indian group all hung out together, the Chinese group all hung out together, the Filipino group hung out together. So all they even on the train, and even though they're integrated at school, of course, and they're all sitting next to white people or different races, as soon as they're out of that environment, they instantly congregate only with their own racial group. Now, I speak quite passable Mandarin, so I was able to listen to the different dialects and so on. And so you've even got a case where the Taiwanese Chinese hang out together, and then the northern Chinese hang out together, and then from different Fujian or different provinces, they hang out together. You've even got that as well. Tribes within tribes. So the children, and yet as soon as they would. They all spoke with an Australian accent when they weren't talking in their original genetic tongue. So again, even born in Australia through the school, and at that age, they're still congregating only with their own type. And that's not a mixed race relationship in that sense. They're just school kids hanging out. But and the white kids, of course, hanging out in their own group as well. So this is the extent of the failure of the integration. Now, the resistance to integrating in terms of a mixed race relationship again with people from other races, it's not. I don't sense there's a lot of white resistance per se. Certainly not on the basis of race. There's a resistance to pick partners, or certainly anything other than casual sexual partners anyway, to pick partners that have very little in common with you, that are culturally very different, have very different attitudes, very different behaviours, very different accepted norms. And even black and brown people born in Australia still have very different attitudes to things. And that's really where the barrier is. Now, in the reverse, say in the case of people from the subcontinent, and particularly Indians, the Hindus and so on, they place a serious premium on genetic purity, ancestral purity, and so on. So they have a very high resistance to integrating with anyone else, far higher than white people ever will. So, and they, even 5-6 generations on being born in Australia or being born in the West, they still send back to the villages of their ancestors for brides and husbands. And they genuinely believe themselves to be culturally and spiritually superior to all other races. This is the Indians I'm talking about here. And so the crossover is, in terms of relationships, is almost non-existent. It would be not even 1/4%. So, and children that decide, Indian children even decide to marry a locally born Indian bride or husband, are under intense family pressure to only go back to the village of their ancestors, to only bring out a pure spiritual and genetic Indian from the subcontinent to marry and then bring them to the West. And this is something that, as I say, even children to Indians that are born in the West, they place great stock on that, even to the point where they'll basically ostracize children that don't toe the line, threaten to cut them out of the will, and they'll never talk to the wider family or community again. And so they come under withering pressure to conform to these things, as indeed to people from other places such as the Middle East. They again, when they're born in Australia, they still send off to some Middle Eastern peasant tribal village to get a bride or a husband, and this is something that they don't want to integrate. They see themselves again as spiritually and genetically or spiritually and culturally superior, and also they want to keep that genetic purity going. Now, you can contrast this with the more advanced Western economies. So if a British migrant or a German migrant or Swedish or Danish or Swiss or French or something, if they come to Australia or the United States or Canada, something like that, there's a much greater possibility that they will marry a locally born person. So, in fact, it would be very rare indeed, almost unheard of, that they send back to the country of their ancestors to bring out a bride or a husband. They'd marry someone locally. They may marry someone who also comes from or their parents came from France. That still happens, but it's rare. They'll typically marry a local person, and within one generation, you just simply wouldn't know that they're Australian or they're American or Canadian. Whereas many generations on, most of the brown and black people still haven't integrated and have no particular intention of integrating, and they want to keep that purity. So white people aren't really the problem here. The resistance that white people have is a behavioural one, not a racial one, whereas the others, it's racial, it's cultural, it's spiritual, it's a whole range of things. community-based, tribal-based. It's a whole range of things that can take, as I say, 7 to 10 generations to break down. And given now the emphasis on multiculturalism, I think even 7 to 10 generations is going to be a big ask. It's probably going to be longer than that, if it even ever happens. So if the Western governments who are forcing this mass migration on an unwilling populace, who haven't even had the chance of voting on it and deciding on it, but if they're going to force that on, then they need to find a different way of creating mixed race relationships, assuming that's their intention. It appears to be, but they're going about it the wrong way, and they're also perceiving that the problem must be the white people, but it's not. It's not. The white people aren't the resistant ones to behaviour, sure. Now, there are cases too where, say, in emerging economies like, I don't know, places like Serbia and Croatia and those sort of things in the Balkans, or even, the very rural Greek communities, the very rural peasant Italian communities, that sort of thing, you still get a bit of a lag there. It takes maybe 3 generations for mixed race relationships and integration to occur. And I'm thinking of some Greek people who came from a very rural Greek area. They were both born in Australia, but they still wanted to only marry other Greek people from Greek families, and that was important to them. But their children are dating anybody. They're not being choosy in that same sense. So there's still a time lag with the more rural communities. There's a Serbian guy I know who came to Australia when he was 2 years old. He's married another Serbian or lady from a Serbian family who was born here, but born in Australia, but they're again from a very rural community, not sophisticated city dwellers, that sort of thing. So that's the general thing around there. But mixed race relationships, less than 2%. Less than 2% of any race integrating with any other race. And the most resistant races are not white. Whites are probably 5th down the list in terms of resistance, and again, that focuses mainly on behavioural issues rather than skin colour and that sort of stuff. So that's my take on that, and I hope that's been helpful and given you a few ideas and things to think about. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.